If the idea of getting a place out in the Japanese countryside appeals to you, whether it be to get out of the city, for a larger house, for lower prices, then you may already have heard of the stories of abandoned houses being sold cheaply or even given away for free. In this video, I'm going to talk about our experience of buying an abandoned house in Japan in more detail, including the process we went through and the costs. We're going to start the renovation soon. I'll update you guys as soon as we start. The information in this video is based on research we did before and after buying and our experience so far. First, I'll give a bit of background about vacant and abandoned houses in Japan, talk about why we bought one, then I'll talk about the process of buying, what to look out for, costs, including renovation and associated costs, hidden costs, financing, and also my thoughts on how to find one for those who are looking. This video is going to be a bit long, so I put markers in the description if you want to skip the parts you're interested in. At the moment we live in a regular 3-bedroom detached house in a small town in Ibaraki, about an hour's drive from central Tokyo, or around 50 minutes by train. You can commute to Tokyo from here, in fact my wife does. It's a typical rice growing region and the town is surrounded by paddy fields. Our abandoned house is nearby. In Japan, vacant houses are called akiya. You may have heard of this term. There's been a bit of news about empty houses in Japan recently. Even though akiya are often referred to as abandoned houses, they're not necessarily abandoned, but unoccupied. They may be managed by the owner or a real estate agent. Of course, some houses are genuinely abandoned. The number of akiya in Japan is only going to increase, particularly in the countryside, with Japan's aging and decreasing population, increased urbanization, Japanese preference for new homes, and falling rural property prices. About 13.5% of houses in Japan are vacant, so you might think that it would be easy to find an akiya to buy. I mean, you could probably choose a random country town and walk down the street and spot an empty house quite quickly. But for those who are looking to buy an akiya, you might have found that it's actually not that easy, which can be a bit frustrating. This is reflected in the statistics. For example, here in Ibaraki Prefecture, which is roughly representative of Japan as a whole, 14.6%, or 184,000, houses, that includes houses and apartments of all shapes and sizes, are vacant, which is slightly above the national average of 13.5% that I mentioned earlier. And of those vacant houses, 56% are available to rent, just no one's renting them. 36% are unmanaged, these are the abandoned houses, so they're not in the market for rent or sale. Some holiday houses and second homes also make up a small percentage. But once you add all of that up, it turns out that less than 3% of the akiya are available for sale. It's an interesting statistic and illustrates why it's not that easy to buy one. There are a few reasons why not many are up for sale. With many houses going vacant, some may assume that no one would want to buy their property. The low rural property prices that I mentioned earlier reduce the incentives to sell. People might be reluctant to sell property that's been in the family for generations, especially if it's for peanuts. Or the property might require extensive cleaning, clearing, or renovation. And if you're not going to get much of a price for it, or if you think it might not sell, then it may not be worth your while. For real estate agents, the commissions on a cheap property are going to be quite low, so they're not going to be particularly interested either. One incentive to sell might be to avoid having to pay tax on the property, which you need to pay even if you don't live in it. But from what I can tell, penalties are not that strictly enforced, and the worst thing that can happen, perhaps, is that the tax office will claim the property. But if it's not worth that much, it's really no big loss. So some property owners might decide to abandon the property altogether. And if they have children, the children might not be interested in looking after the property either. It's not so difficult to renounce an inheritance in Japan. So say you live in Tokyo and your parents who live in the country pass away, you could refuse to inherit the property and the property would go abandoned. You might particularly want to do this if there was a debt on the property, which you would inherit too, whether it be to the tax office or to the bank. You might wonder why we wanted to buy a place in rural Japan. Well, as you can imagine, it's not as an investment. I grew up in Australia and have fond memories of playing footy and cricket in the backyard with my brother and cousins. I wanted the same for my boys. Right now we don't even have a garden. So I wanted a lawn to play sports, some space to do some gardening, and maybe even grow some vegetables. Plus we wanted an outdoor space where we as a family could relax and barbecue in. I love barbecues, but they're kind of frowned upon where we're living now in a built-up space, and probably for good reason. Also, I wanted a bigger place for when my parents come and stay with us when they visit from Australia, also when friends visit. So price was a factor, of course, but it wasn't the most important thing. Also, we wanted to stay in the same area, close to my wife's mother, and so that our boys could go to the same school. If you want something cheap, in this area where we are now, you can buy a second-hand 4-bedroom detached house on 170 square meters from the local real estate agent for about 5 million yen, that you could move into straight away. Or you can rent a 4-bedroom house for around 60,000 yen a month. But you won't get much of a garden there. Japanese buyers tend to prefer smaller blocks and like to fill the block with their house, leaving little space for a garden. They often build their houses up next to each other, even in the country, in towns as well as in hamlets. It makes sense. You want to use as much land as possible for farming. Also, the larger the land and house, the bigger the property tax bill is. But I was ideally looking for around 2,000 square meters, or half an acre. However, it's not so easy to find large blocks of residential land, even in the countryside. Large blocks are usually sold to developers who subdivide the land and sell it off. I saw a 1,300 square meter block nearby on the market for around 22 million yen, which was too much for us, and for other people. Last time I checked, it was still for sale. So I thought our best bet was to buy a farmhouse on a larger block of land. The idea of a farmhouse also appealed to me as the farming area is a bit more isolated, and they have sheds that I could perhaps use for a business. But when I looked into that, I didn't find many on the market. Any that I did find were really expensive and outside our budget. Plus, we're not registered farmers and are not allowed to buy farmland, so couldn't buy a farmhouse unless it had been converted or subdivided into residential land. To register as a farmer, you need to demonstrate that you'll be able to operate a viable farming business, which usually involves a business plan and buying a minimum amount of land. In Ibaraki, it's 5,000 square meters. So that's when I started looking for an akiya. But we were really restricted in our search because of our need to stay in the same area. Otherwise, when I was searching for places, I found some really interesting properties further out from Tokyo. I'll put some links below. You may have heard of the Akiya Bank, the government program that matches vacant property with tenants and buyers at cheap prices. I won't talk in detail about this as we didn't buy our property through an Akiya Bank, so I don't have any direct experience buying it this way. But we did look into it as an option. One advantage of the Akiya Bank is that in some areas you can get subsidies for renovations or tax breaks, but it depends on certain conditions such as age, hiring locally, or number of children. It varies by location, so you need to check. However, there weren't any properties listed in the Akiya Bank that were in our local area. Plus, the listed prices didn't strike me as that cheap. I know you can negotiate the price with the owner, but there wasn't anything that really suited us. So we thought the best way to find a place would be through word of mouth by our friends or acquaintances. Maybe someone knew someone who had an akiya that they were interested in selling, or maybe someone was looking to downsize from a place they were living in. My mother-in-law runs a kisaten, which is a Japanese-style cafe, and has lots of friends and acquaintances in the local area. So we kind of put the word out on the street that we were looking for a place. We didn't really get anywhere, but one day one of our friends noticed a property in the local newsletter and let us know. This would be the property that we'd eventually buy. It was being auctioned by the Ibaraki Tax Claim Control Office. It's the governmental organisation responsible for unpaid tax debts. As I've mentioned earlier, property tax is an issue when holding on to akiya. Some people just decide to stop paying or maybe can't afford to pay, and if the owner dies with tax debt on the property, the children may not want to inherit, which is what happened in our case. So the tax office took possession of the property. The tax office holds a mixed bag of residential, farm and forest land, and in most cases I still think that the prices are a little more expensive than they should be. Each prefecture has their own tax claim control office. If you go to their websites, you can see a listing of all the properties they have available for auction. I'll put some Japanese search terms in the description below, but you will need to be able to read Japanese to be able to understand, as they don't have much information in English. Or you could just use Google Translate to get an idea. The tax offices hold regular auctions. Some auctions are held online via Yahoo Auctions, and some auctions are held in person at their head offices. Both the Yahoo auction and the in-person auction are blind, sealed bids. In order to participate, you have to put down 10% of the minimum bid as a refundable deposit. You get one bid, and at the end of the time period, whoever has the highest bid is the winner of the auction. In our case, we took part in the auction at the tax office itself. The auction was held over 1 hour. It was a bit nerve-wracking as there were quite a lot of people there as they were auctioning many properties at the same time, and we didn't know who else was bidding for our property and how much they were going to bid. We put in a bid for 3 million yen, and at the end of the hour, it turned out there was one other bidder who put in a bid for just over the minimum price of 2.9 million. It would have been ideal to have won by less, but at the end of the day, we won, and I was just happy that we weren't the only bidder and hadn't just bid against ourselves. The property was not just vacant, but also abandoned, with lots of cleaning to do. The other issue was that it was missing an official border. This factored into the lack of interest and price. I think the price was fair, given the size of the land at just under 1,400 square meters. But I think if the akiya market functioned a little more efficiently, you would see lower prices and prices going closer to zero like you've seen on the news. Buying from the tax office doesn't have any age, job or family requirements. If you win the bid, you're free to do what you want with the property. Just make sure that the land is a classification that you're allowed to purchase, such as residential land, which anyone can buy, and not farmland, which requires you to be a registered farmer. You can get details of the properties, including the address and also the minimum bid, from the tax office website. If you contact them, Japanese likely required, they may come out to visit you and run through the whole process and give you a few more details about the property. Since the address of the property is listed on the website, you can go and visit the property yourself directly, though technically you're not supposed to go inside the house. The tax office may not even have the keys. Also, there may be an occupant in the house. But if you're serious about buying, it'd be best to inspect the property beforehand, which is what we did. We managed to find a way in and have a look around and explore. It was a bit scary at first, going into the abandoned house, but it was well worth it in the end. We also spoke to the neighbours to check if there was any kind of story to the house. Read the information carefully. As I mentioned earlier, one thing to look out for is whether the house is occupied or not. Sometimes the owner may still be living there, but has fallen behind their tax payments, and the tax office has taken possession of their property. You can still buy the property, but you'd have to deal with evicting the occupant yourself. I wouldn't be comfortable evicting what might be a vulnerable or elderly person from their family home, so we steered well clear of these sort of properties. In fact, we actually did find a property nearby that also suited our conditions, but there was an occupant in there, so we gave that one a wide berth. If you're considering buying a vacant or abandoned house, some things you need to look out for are: how much work does it need? Depending on the age of the house, you're probably going to need to upgrade the plumbing and the electricals. Also, if there are any problems with the foundations, that's going to be a very expensive thing to fix. Is it affected by termites? Termites are a huge problem in Japan. Sometimes you can tell whether there are termites by trails leading to the house, but other times they may be hidden inside the wood and harder to notice at first glance. Of course, one big thing that people are concerned about when buying properties in Japan is their resistance to earthquakes. Japan updates its earthquake standards from time to time, and is one of the reasons why Japanese people tend to prefer newer homes to old ones. So you need to consider that and take it into account if you're planning renovations. As I mentioned earlier, if you're buying an akiya, it may be a little bit more difficult to conduct a thorough inspection before the purchase. In addition, particularly if you're buying through a public auction, you should double check whether there's an official border or not. The land we were buying had been subdivided from a larger farm, so we were buying the residential land portion and not the surrounding farmland. So there wasn't an official border for some of the boundaries. Now, you can get a border done, and we have got ours done, but it is a risk. I mean, there are certain things you need to do, and you need to hire a professional to organize it for you, so you do need to take that into consideration. I'll talk in more detail about the implications of not having a border later on. So there will be some risk, and you do need a backup plan. In our case, our backup plan was to knock down the house and build a new property on the land. Thankfully, we haven't had to resort to that. Since buying, we've had a full and thorough inspection carried out from top to bottom. The only issue that we didn't know about before buying was that the septic tank has been damaged by a tree root, so we'll need to deal with that. The foundations, posts and beams have been resilient towards earthquakes over the last 30 years and have barely budged, so we're very confident in the structural integrity of the house. Of course, when we do the renovations, we'll take into consideration strengthening measures against earthquakes. There are taxes to consider when buying a second-hand property in Japan, including akiya. The largest tax we've had to pay so far, and the one that's caught us most by surprise, is the registration tax. It's a one-time tax that applies to any property purchase in Japan. Not the tax itself, we knew that was coming, but it was the amount that caught us by surprise. Now, we didn't do a very good job with our research, and we didn't realize that we would have to pay the tax on the fixed asset tax book value of the property, not the purchase price. The fixed asset tax book value is the value for the property that the government holds. The government reassesses this value every 3 years through some sort of audit. I don't exactly know how it's calculated, but there is some process. And I've heard, though, it's hard to change. One way is through subdivision of the land. Another way is if the buildings on the land substantially change, or if there's an error in the record. In our case, the property was subdivided 5 years ago, at which time it was assessed that the value of the property was 12.5 million yen. So the tax rate of 2% was applied to this value, not the 3 million yen that we paid for it. Therefore, we had to pay 260,000 yen to register the property in our name. So you need to keep this in mind if you're purchasing an akiya, because the fixed asset tax book value is likely to be higher than the purchase price. So even if you got a property for 0 yen, you're going to be on the hook for this tax. We've also got property acquisition tax coming up, which we haven't paid yet, although there are deductions if the property is going to be your primary residence. But we estimate this tax is also going to be around 260,000 yen. Based on the current book value, we'll also need to pay the fixed asset tax and the city planning tax, which are generally property taxes, and are going to come to around 160,000 yen a year. I'll put some links in the description below if you want to explore this topic on taxes in a bit more detail. I did read somewhere that there were potentially tax breaks in some prefectures for people who are buying akiya. I inquired at our local city office, and unfortunately there was nothing there available to us. Also, the tax office, who we were buying the land from, were not offering us any tax breaks there either. But one advantage of buying through the tax office is there was no real estate agent commission, which is usually around 3%. One issue I mentioned earlier was the border. Now, our land was subdivided from farmland, so some parts of our property didn't have an official border. In Japan, borders are usually marked by stones or metal plates. To register a border, you need to contract a land surveyor who specializes in borders to make measurements of the property and also indicate where the marker stones should go. He'll then organise with neighbours and local government officials to come around all at the same time to inspect the border and then give their approval. Once that's done, the surveyor will then put the markers in place and submit the details to the Legal Affairs Bureau. This process can be expensive and time-consuming. The main implications of not having an official border is that it's unlikely that you'll be able to get a mortgage or a secured loan, and also buyers might be a bit wary about buying a property without an official border. It's not so common. Generally, real estate agents will only accept properties that have a border, but it's worth double checking anyway. And if you're buying from the tax office, they'll also state in their prospectus whether the border is an issue or not. So we knew what we were getting into and the risk involved, but decided to go ahead anyway. Fortunately, it all worked out well for us because the border is now done and dusted. We were lucky. We got an introduction from a friend to a land surveyor who charged us a little bit less than expected, although still expensive, an amount of 300,000 yen. We're glad to get that out of the way though. Now, you could still get an unsecured loan without an official border, though it just reduces your options. There are separate fees for taking out a mortgage in Japan, which I won't go into detail now, but they would apply to all properties regardless of whether you're getting an akiya or not. Our house is a Japanese minka or kominka style house, sometimes called an old folk house in English. They're a traditional house with a distinctive steep roof and deep eaves that used to be a common housing style for farmers and artisans. Nowadays they're a typical style of farmhouse. You see them throughout the Japanese countryside. Getting a minka was probably the second priority for us after land size. A minka in good condition and renovated nicely is really impressive. We'll see if we can achieve that. For me, they have a lot more character than most of the modern standard houses in Japan. But on the other hand, they can be more expensive to renovate and maintain. Imagine how much a roof like this costs to repair. Especially the older ones that are over 100 years old will likely need foundation work, which gets expensive. We were warned when we were researching getting a minka that renovations could cost as much as a new house. In fact, since we've bought the place, we've visited some model houses that have been done beautifully, but have cost up to 50 million yen. You might also be wondering why I'm crouching right now. Well, this is a pretty long video. I'm just trying to mix things up. At the beginning, I kind of planned to do almost all of the renovations myself, just leaving the electricals and plumbing, stuff like that, to professionals. We also considered just doing the bare essentials and moving in and then renovating bit by bit while we lived here. Since then, we've had a bit of a change of mind. We really want to do a lot of work to the house, really do it justice and make it look really, really nice. And that would take quite a long time if we were to do it just by ourselves, going the DIY route, if we had the skills to do it as nicely as we imagine. So as a result, we're working with an architect who's a friend of ours, and also we're discussing it with the original builder, as well as some other renovation companies. We're just waiting on a few more quotes, and we'll make a decision hopefully very, very shortly. I'll give a more detailed breakdown of some of the quotes in another video. But to give you an idea of the renovation costs based on the quotes we've received so far, I think if you're going down the DIY route, assuming you'd still get a professional to do the electricals and the plumbing, I reckon the place could be done for about 60 to 70 million yen. Hold your horses. Obviously still having problems with Japanese numbers there. I should have said 6 to 7 million yen, not 60 to 70 million. That includes the roof, and that includes fixing the septic tank. Of course, that depends a lot on what sort of materials you're going to use and really how much you're going to be able to do yourself. Now, we're probably going to spend a bit of money on what might be considered luxuries, like real wood floors, a wood-burning stove, a loft, stairs, an onsen-style bath, as well as wood decking all around the house. To go with one of the big renovation companies, the price is going to start at around 25 million yen. A slightly smaller company, around 20 to 22 million yen, and working with an architect and a builder, around 15 million yen. There are advantages and disadvantages of each. For example, going with one of the big companies, you get a 5-year warranty and servicing during that period if anything did go wrong. But they're also the most expensive. Now, those costs don't include the garden. We're going to knock down 4 sheds out here. We've got quotes already from demolition companies. It cost about 1.2 million yen to knock down the sheds and clear the rubbish. And that includes some of the existing rubbish within the sheds. It gives you a bit of an idea. We're keeping the 2-storied house that used to have the tractor, and we're going to renovate that at a later date, which is an additional cost. We'll do the rest of the garden ourselves, but obviously there are costs involved there. We've already bought quite a few tools, for example, a clearing saw, a chainsaw, an axe, and a wood chipper. But these are things that we'll continue to use as we live in the property. In terms of other costs, we haven't really spent so much so far on cleaning. Because we haven't been in a huge rush, we've kind of been able to break stuff up and put it bit by bit in with the regular garbage, which is collected twice a week for the burnable rubbish and once a week for unburnable. I've rented a light truck a couple of times and taken rubbish to the garbage centre myself. It costs about 155 yen per 10 kilograms. For example, the other day I took around 360 kilograms in about 3 trips, and it cost roughly 5,500 yen. Once it's all done, I'll let you know how much in total we have spent on cleaning. Financing has been the most complicated part of this project, and looking back, we could have been a bit smarter about it and done a bit more research. So in this section, what I'll do is I'll talk about what we've done to finance the purchase so far, how we're going to finance the renovations, and also I'll talk about the most suitable bank, I think, for this kind of project. First of all, I'm a foreigner here on a spouse visa who's been in Japan for less than 2 years, and most of my income is based overseas. So I'm highly unlikely to be able to get a home loan in Japan. Fortunately, my wife's Japanese with a full-time job, so when I talk about we here, it's really my wife. All of the banks we spoke to didn't have a problem financing an akiya, so that wasn't a problem in itself, but we did face 2 obstacles when trying to obtain finance to carry out this project. First, and this is due to it being an auction through the tax office, which is not a common way of purchasing a property in Japan, while we could get pre-approval for the mortgage before the auction, when buying from the tax office, you have 1 week to pay the full amount in cash after the date of the winning bid. In our case, it was 3 million, minus the 10% deposit that we put down to participate in the auction. According to the bank that we were speaking to, this 1 week time frame didn't give them enough time to process the official mortgage application between winning the bid and confirming the purchase price, obtaining relevant documentation, and finalising the loan approval to be able to release the funds within that 1 week. Some people get bridge loans to cover this amount, and once the mortgage is approved, pay it off. But some banks don't allow you to use your mortgage to pay off a separate loan, so you'd need to check this carefully beforehand. We didn't want to do this as we wanted to maintain flexibility. We didn't know how long it would take to clean the property and organise the renovations, which we wanted to fund with a mortgage or loan, but didn't know which bank or product would be most suitable at that stage. So we had to use cash from our savings and investments, which was not ideal. Now, we only spoke to one bank before the purchase, who turned out to be not very good. And looking back, we should have spoken to a few more banks to see if they could have been able to help us there. We've found in the process of looking at loans to pay for the renovations that Japanese banks vary greatly in their requirements and policies, so it's possible that there are banks out there that might have been more flexible. The second issue was specific to our situation in that we were purchasing a property without a completed official border. So that would have prevented us from getting a mortgage anyway. Banks won't approve secured loans on properties without an official border. In regards to banks, when buying a rural property that requires a bit of work in the yard as well as the house, we found JA Bank, that's the Japan Agricultural Cooperative Bank, to be the most flexible. Most banks we found won't allow you to use loan funds to pay for yard work, for example, demolishing sheds, cutting down trees. But JA does. Anyone can join JA Bank, you don't have to be a farmer. They have two options. One is a loan secured to your property, i.e. a mortgage, and the amount you can borrow really depends on the property and your financial situation. And an unsecured renovation loan, or reform loan, as they call it in Japan, of up to 15 million yen. JA Bank allow you to pay multiple suppliers, whereas some banks only allow you to pay one contractor to do the entire project. So we can pay, for example, different contractors to do the house, whether it be a builder, electrician, plumber, separately. You don't have to pay through one single contractor. And we can also pay for the demolition of sheds as well, separately through another company. Note that the interest rate on a reform loan is around 3 to 4% and higher than a mortgage, which is typically less than 1% currently. Also, and I don't think this is different from other countries, but you can't use a mortgage or a reform loan to pay for DIY work. You're expected to pay a professional. If you want to fund DIY, you'll need to get a personal loan, which has a slightly higher interest rate and also a lower maximum borrowing amount, around 50 to 80 million yen in Japan. So you can see buying an akiya is not as cheap as it may seem, even if the property were free. Renovation and other costs quickly add up. Even if you renovate the house, it'll depreciate straight away, and in 10 and 20 years, it'll be worth very little again. Especially when you consider that there is a large generation of baby boomers in their 70s living in the countryside. Japanese life expectancy is high, but the cold reality is that over the next 20 years, more and more houses are going to go vacant and abandoned. So after hearing all that, you may wonder, is it really worth it? If you're looking to buy an akiya, I think it's got to come down to reasons other than price. There are cheaper ways to buy a house in Japan if you just want a roof over your head. But if you're doing it for lifestyle reasons, want to enjoy the process, or want to do something a little bit different, then it could be a pretty good option for you, particularly if you're going to stay in Japan long term. Generally, it's going to be cheaper than buying land and building a new house. And if you're flexible and can live further out from one of the centers or live in any part of Japan, then you really might be able to find a bargain. Some place that has large land sizes, doesn't require much renovation, and it's going to be cheap. For us, it will certainly be cheaper than finding a similarly sized block in this area and building a new house on it. Otherwise, renting would likely be cheaper over the short to medium term, especially if you go through something like an akiya bank where you can get some pretty reasonable rates on long-term contracts. We were tired of renting. We wanted the freedom and the utility of having our own place, knowing that we can do anything we want with it, and also having the security that it's ours in the long term. If you're weighing up moving out of Tokyo or a big city into the countryside, then the difference in price is going to be even larger. In the future, I might do some videos of life around here, not that we're in the deep, dark countryside. Given though that finding an akiya is relatively difficult, given that there aren't that many on sale, I think I'd advise people who are looking for a place to really speak to friends and acquaintances. Lots of these akiya aren't on the market for reasons I've mentioned before, but if you ask around, you might just find that there are people who are willing to sell or know of people who are willing to sell. So maybe go around, speak to akiya banks, local government, local real estate agents. They may know of properties that just aren't listed. Some areas also have other programs that help you find an akiya, particularly if you're going to be setting up a local business. Or maybe have a look at the local tax office and find a property like we did. You never know, there might be something available, particularly if you're not in the akiya bank's target demographic. Remember, you can negotiate the prices in most cases. From what I've seen, the listed property prices are generally higher than the true market value. There are more and more companies these days that are buying old houses, including kominka, renovating them and selling them on. Sure, you will be paying a higher price for these properties, but it does take away a lot of the risk in buying an akiya. Also saves you doing a lot of the cleaning and renovating yourself if you're not that way inclined. I've put some links in the description to useful websites that I've come across in my research that hopefully you might find useful as well in your search for a property. Otherwise, feel free to ask me any questions in the comments section. Also, stay tuned, and if you're not subscribed already, please subscribe and like this video. I'm going to start the videos on the renovations hopefully very soon. Thanks for watching.